Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to Gear Curiosities. Today, we are checking out the latest addition to Ceriatone's arsenal of hot rod Plexis, the Gargoyle. As some of you might have seen in the parody unboxing video, this is the new toy, a new addition in an increasingly superfluous amplifier collection, though this one will definitely get a lot of uses, and of course we'll go over all that stuff in this video. So a couple things to get out of the way immediately. First of all, this actually doesn't represent the stock product aesthetically. Everything else it does. So the tones you'll hear, the functionality, everything else is on the base Gargoyle that you should be able to purchase. However, I specifically requested the stainless steel look in terms of the face plates, the back plates, as well as the white trim accents on the head cab, because I really like the slash appetite for destruction look, and I wanted it to kind of match with other stuff I have. It actually turned out to look 10 times better than I thought it was going to. So this is like a supermodel in a very below average group of other gear, but yeah, it's gorgeous. Another important thing to note, and actually like half the reason this turned out looking the way it does, is because this started as a completely custom amplifier, nothing off the shelf. A little while back, I reached out to Ceritone's owner, Nick, who has been an absolute pleasure to work with, by the way. I've picked his brain on all kinds of stuff, and I don't know how that guy has any time to respond to emails, you know, churning out the amps his company does and running a business on top of that. So that meant a lot to me. But I reached out to him and I was like, look, I want a hot rod Plexi. I really like what your amplifiers are doing, but there's a few things in terms of quality of life features, in terms of what I want the amplifier to be able to do, both on the lower gain end as well as the extremely high gain end. But by the time Nick and his team finalized the circuit and I gave my thumbs up on it, he decided to just make this a model anyone can order, and I'm stoked about that. I always like sharing stuff like this. I think there's no point in it being exclusive. Kind of the same deal with the custom guitar. And if you hate the name Gargoyle, blame me, because I was the one that named it. And I did so before it was going to be a public amplifier per se. Don't get me wrong, I love the reruns of the old Gargoyle cartoons. I think I watched that on like Boomerang when I was a kid. But I actually named it after the Bell Gargoyles in Dark Souls 1 because they absolutely destroyed me the first time I played that game. But you know, after a dozen or so playthroughs, I've got a badge of honor to show my conquering of the first Bell of Awakening. So in a sense, this amplifier is basically a modification of the pre-existing Chupacabra amp, and that is basically a best of modification of pre-existing modifications to other Marshall-like amps. So obviously with all of this, there's going to be comparisons drawn. There's going to be, well, this is just a clone of that, or this amp sounds like this, because they're all part of the same family. They share much the same DNA. But as with all this stuff, whether you're talking about a Splon, talking about a Friedman, a Metro, a Fortin, a Ceriatone, they're all their own individual circuits. The way the law works, if you draw your own circuit, you change some values, you add new features, it is inherently a new product. To go over some of the critical specs, this is a single channel 50 watt tube head using a single pair of EL34s. Fun fact, I initially requested a pair of KT77s because I really like those tubes and, you know, comparable amp heads, but this amp is actually really dependent on the power amp sound, and because the tone stack's already voiced a little more contemporary than a lot of, you know, Plexi style heads, then it actually didn't turn out as good as we'd hoped. So I trusted Nick's judgment and had him put in 34s instead. So I'm glad I did that because it turned out sounding great. And that's a good thing for you guys because you can hear these tones, and this is basically exactly what you're going to get with any off-the-shelf Gargoyle. Turning to the rear panel though, you'll find a set of bias test points so that you may swap out the power tubes later down the road and manually adjust the bias. You can find the pots on the inside of the chassis, so if you don't know what you're doing, have an amp tech do it, please. The next feature is one that I highly requested and one that I'm really spoiled to on other amp heads I have. And that of course is the line out with an adjustable level control. And for those of you that know what that is, I'm sorry for harping on this for the millionth time, but for those that don't, you can find a similar feature on like Mesa Boogie heads in the form of the slave out. They're on Friedmans, they're on a lot of Randalls. And basically this takes a line level tap off of the power amp, which is great because you're still getting the tone contribution of the power section, but it's safe to run through line level equipment. And you can do a lot of different things with this. If you're recording and a stack like this and you've mic'd up the cabinet, you can take that raw signal, record it to your audio workstation, and kind of recab the sound, putting a different impulse response after it if you're not 100% happy with how the recording turned out. Or if you're doing like a wet, dry, wet setup, you can take that line out, run it through a, say, stereo multi-effects unit, put that through a stereo power amp, power 2 more cabs, and then you have a perfect stereo wet, dry, wet cab setup, and you're still getting the full amp sound everywhere. That's something that you miss with an effects send if you're doing it that way, where you'll have to have an additional tube power amp. And from there, you'll find your typical speaker outputs and impedance selector, as well as a very nice transparent effects loop. We won't be going over the effects loop in this video, though I have tested it with noise gates, EQ pedals, delays, reverbs, choruses, everything worked flawlessly and sounded really great. Coming back to the front panel, let's talk about the pair of inputs. Yes, it looks like there's 4. These 2 are dummies, so no jumpering on this amplifier, but really not needed with the way the gain controls work, because this is like the split 2203, 2204, where you have a high sensitivity as well as a low sensitivity input. And this is something you don't want to ignore. If you're playing anything other than just full balls to the walls metal, boosting with an overdrive, then you'll want to play around with the low input because it's really cool. It does bypass the gain 1 control, so you do lose that functionality, but say you're playing a more classic song that relies on riding the volume and tone controls to get an edge of breakup or clean sound, and maybe you want to push the front end with a tube screamer or an overdrive pedal to make up for that lost gain if you want to go into more higher gain rhythm or lead sound. The low input's a great way to start on that. I won't be showing the full capability of it because I am a metal player, so I don't use it like that, but you can get some really, doable clean tones out of this thing, so don't overlook it. Going back to the high input, of course, opens up the full potential of this amplifier, starting with what I think is the star of the show, the split gain 1 and gain 2 controls. And this is a staple on many of the other Hot Rod Plexi amplifiers, as well as many modified amps that came before it. And you can kind of think of it in this way. Gain 2 is basically your traditional Plexi gain. You turn it up, you get more drive, you get more saturation. It works the way you think it would. Gain 1, on the other hand, is focused more on the upper mids and treble, to the point that, let's say you're going for a tight metal sound. If you turn this up to around, say, between 8 or 9, and you dial back on gain 2, you don't need a drive pedal at all for most stuff. It really is that balls to the walls in terms of gain, but it's not overly saturated to the point it becomes mush. It's very articulate, it's very musical, which is a hard thing to balance. So generally, if I'm plugging straight through this amplifier, unless I'm going for a really vintage sound that doesn't have much of that high-end sparkle, then I'll keep gain 1 at least 1.5 to 2 spots ahead of gain 2. So let's say for a classic crunch sound, both of them at noon or 5 will work pretty well. But if you're going for like a more thrashy sound, then maybe something like this is what will achieve that for you. Below gain 2 is yet another extremely powerful control you'll want to use whether or not you're using this as a pedal platform, and that is the bright switch. In the center, there's no bright cap whatsoever, so if you're using a particularly treble focused drive pedal, you'll probably want to keep that in the center, or you're going for like a doom sound that we don't want any high mids or treble. That'd be heresy. Towards the power switch on the left position though, that engages a 4700 picofarad bright cap, and that adds some of that much needed upper frequency content if you're using this straight through the amp. On the other side is where things start getting really crazy, and that is a 1000 picofarad cap, which means it gets really bright, really crunchy. This is like the Brown Sound Variac switch for me. That's what I really like using it for. Anything else, it's a little too much, but it's a really awesome option if you want that just, pissed off in your face Plexi sound. To the left of that is your typical bass, middle, treble Plexi tone stack. It behaves pretty much the way you would expect it to. Compared to a lot of other contemporary amp heads, this one's kind of hard to screw up. It's very forgiving, kind of dummy proof. And the only thing with this is it is voiced in such a way that even for a lot of contemporary tones, I end up dialing up the mids a lot more than I normally would, but it's still great because it has a lot of headroom in both ways, which is something you don't see as much on a typical non-modified version. However, for more vintage tones, you might find that a higher treble setting and lower bass is actually what's going to sound best. So don't be afraid to experiment, listen with your ears, not your eyes, and you just might be surprised at what sounds best on this tone stack. That brings us to the power amp controls with Deep and Presence. Deep is an add-on that you may not see on a lot of Plexi style amplifiers, but Presence works in a way that you'd kind of expect with this kind of amp. And I constantly find myself having Presence at 0 or below 2 for sure if I have a higher treble setting, as they kind of interact with each other to the point that if you have a lower treble setting, you might want to raise Presence. So it's kind of a balancing act between those two. But with Deep, this is kind of more of its own individual lower bass control, and I really like it because even if you do dial back bass, you can still have some of that low end thump, and it's at a frequency such that it's not redundant where it's going to get locked off in a recording environment because you're going to kind of do a high pass on guitars anyway, but it's also not too high to the point that it makes the bass control redundant or it overlaps too much where things become boomy. So definitely play around with that. If you're going for more traditional sounds, keep it at 0. That's the same as having it off, but it's definitely nice to have for more contemporary genres. And finally, the master volume control. This is something that often gets overlooked in smaller wattage amplifiers because it can be pretty significant in terms of the sound. This also has a gain switch, same kind of three-way switch as the bright switch, except this controls some clipping diodes in the circuit. I know some people are going to say, oh no, not clipping diodes, because they hated the JCM 900 for that same reason. Completely different sound. There's always one set that is engaged, though it is extremely subtle, and that is the center position. They are so subtle to the point that I actually thought the center position was a bypass switch until I contacted Nick and he corrected me on that. And then the left and right positions engage to other different sets of diodes. I'll put the names here because I cannot remember that to save my life. But they are very, very subtle to the point that I am constantly flipping between the two settings for all sorts of playing styles. You know, 1 minute I like this for down-tuned metal. The next minute I also like it for AC/DC. Sometimes I don't play with anything, but generally, if you're going after a more scooped sound, then you'll want to have one of the two edge sets engaged. The more traditional sounds, I keep them off. With the other positions, you will hear a noticeable drop in output volume, which means the master volume actually becomes even more usable for recording and even gigging purposes. So you can kind of open up the power amp a little bit. But you know, even with them engaged, this is still a super loud amp. but you're in ear bleeding territory if you bypass them altogether. As the recurring viewers will know, I am a metalhead at heart, so obviously we've got to boost this thing. Anything from straight up clean boost to, clipping diode pedals like a super overdrive or tube screamer absolutely sound awesome through this thing. But what makes it super cool is the gain 1 control gives you another opportunity for fine-tuning some of those higher end frequencies, to the point that a lot of the times I end up rolling the tone control way further back than I ever normally would for other high gain amps, because it just doesn't need it as much. With that, I generally stay away from that rightmost bright switch position and towards the left or even center if I have a particularly aggressive pedal, but it does give you even more capability than those amps that don't have this kind of split setup. Now, my ultimate litmus test for high gain tube heads is how does it handle an extended range guitar? Can you take something like a 8-string tuned in F or E flat and put it through your favorite clean boost with a fixed EQ like the grind pedal, or your favorite crappy EQ pedal like the Boss GE7, and dial in the brutes? And yeah, this amp passes with flying colors. If you get nothing else from this video, I hope that you at least take away that there's no real perfect death metal amp or perfect classic rock amp. There's really just good amps. And if you have a good bedrock, a good foundation for your design, like this amplifier that relies on decades old, circuits and just with some slight modifications, you can make it work for about anything. And this is a, golden example of that. And this particular amp is just so versatile. So obviously what I want to use it for is mainly for its metal capabilities. In fact, I plan to use this as kind of the first and foremost rhythm amp on some songs I'm working on, kind of blending it with some other heads as well. But it can do so much more than that. I'm definitely going to take advantage of that on the channel. I've wanted a head like this to test pedals and other tones through, so this will be my main platform for those kind of sounds. If you're chasing any of the tones that we've showcased in this video, no matter what genre of music, what subcategory, then if you're willing to put up with a few of the minor limitations of this design, this is a great place to start. And if this isn't exactly your cup of tea, there's way more designs that Nick and Ceriatone offers with the Hot Rod Plexi line. So maybe you need another channel, maybe you need a few more switches to flip. They're all out there, but he's definitely created something that is specialized, has a ton of value, and really, I think, puts a lot of other amps, gives them a run for their money. So this is generally the part where I talk about price and if I recommend something and whatnot. And I generally use Gear Curiosities as a platform to talk about discontinued products and things that you can only recommend to use, and how that all plays into buying something that's equivalent new. And with this being a new product, it's harder for me to do that for the main reason that I don't actually know what this thing costs stock, because I paid a price for it, but that included shipping, that included the extra cost for faceplates and the aesthetic, because this is all lower volume, stuff. So that does hike the price a little bit. But I can say that I paid in the ballpark of $1,600 US, brand new. That's kind of crazy for what the competition's going for. For instance, a production Friedman amp That doesn't even buy you the 50 watt runt. That barely buys you the 20 watt pink taco. That I think might get you a used Splon depending on what you're going after. And you know, that clears some of the higher end Marshall stuff that's not even nearly as capable as this thing is. So let's just call it 1600 flat. If you live in, you know, the middle 50% of America, it's going to cost less than that if you get the straight stock option. But if you want exactly what I have, it might cost a little more. So even then, you know, I think that's what it should cost in this day and age. And that cost buys you more than an amp. It's some outrageous quality control. I mean, the circuit just looks gorgeous to look at, an amazing assembly job. The transformers are hand wound. Everything was really brushed over with a fine-tooth comb. All the pots just feel great. I don't know, it's been more than just buying an amp in terms of an experience. And like I said, working with Nick was an absolute pleasure. When I say work, I mean him replying to my volley of emails. So yeah, it's more than just a product at the end of the day. And that's what I like to support. I'd much rather, you know, give my money to someone like that who I really see what it's going towards. You can speak with a person. And you know, Nick's a great guy. As everyone in his team that I've dealt with was really a pleasure. Now here's my dirty little secret. If the amp market were just a little different today, there's a good chance I would have never found these guys. And that's a damn shame because I really like the way this turned out. But I feel like there's such a huge opportunity for branding and brand recognition that's just being pissed away by Marshall amps. And because that's what we're ultimately talking about in all of this, whether we're talking about those aforementioned Friedman, Splon, Metro amps, Ceriatone, they all harken back to circuits that were originated by Marshall. Because it all harkens back to Fender, and Fender harkens back to RCA, and RCA keeps going. We're not talking about the legal or ethic, you know, side of these circuits. The point is, when we're talking about these tones, everyone thinks of an EL34 powered Marshall head. And at this point in time, I don't understand how Marshall has allowed this to keep going for several decades of people playing modified Marshalls by other people, or allowing these smaller startup companies to basically take circuits that are very similar to theirs and, you know, sell a different modification of it. I'm not saying they shouldn't be allowed to exist. That's the whole point of our capitalist society. It's a good thing at the end of the day, but I don't understand how at this point in time, Marshall doesn't have a hot rod Marshall. It kills me. I mean, if, you know, I hate to admit it, but because of their power as a brand, because of how much real estate they own in guitar centers and in local music stores and in Sweetwater and all of this, if they had a amplifier that had split gain controls, that had some of these quality of life features, and it cost another $400 to $500, I wouldn't even blink an eye. I would have bought the Marshall because it says Marshall on it. And I don't know why they don't do that. I don't know why they keep letting other competitors beat them at their own game. And it can't be about, you know, oh, we've got this legacy to hold up. We've got this quality assurance. We're trying to, you know, appeal to this certain type of player, or else you wouldn't have the Marshall MG series, or certainly not the damn Code series. And it can't be about cost because they sell low volume hand-wired reissues for north of $2,000. So even if they did all this in, you know, custom shop quantities, because that's probably all it would take, then it would still be a profitable venture for them. The legwork's done. Like, everyone on, even their brother has kind of figured this out. Imagine this for a moment. Let's say that Burger King takes a McDonald's Big Mac, 3 buns and all, and they replace the Thousand Island-like sauce with a spicy Thousand Island. It's, you know, pretty much the same sandwich. It has obviously different beef, different spices, different suppliers for whatever that will, at the end of the day, make it a different product. But it's, you know, all inspired by this kind of stuff. And, you know, there's going to be an audience for that. There's going to be an audience for the spicy side of guitar playing. And maybe it won't sell as well. But do you think for a minute that McDonald's wouldn't look at that and think, why are we giving away our market share to a competitor? Makes no sense. So I really don't know what Marshall's doing. I mean, I know they've got to be making bank on a lot of these reissues, like the miniature 2203s, miniature Plexis, Silver Jubilee. But from a consumer's perspective, there is such an obvious demand for amplifiers like this that if Marshall just came out with something that it wasn't even as good and could be more expensive, it would sell because it has Marshall on the front of it and it's marketed towards the high game players, and they already have a big roster of players that, you know, are sponsored by Marshall, or at least were at one point, that I don't see how it would be any problem for them. So I don't understand it. I'm glad it's, you know, in a way that it is the situation we have, because it's better for more small businesses, and I'm ultimately happy that I ended up finding someone that could cater exactly towards the needs of what I wanted and what many other players are going to want going forward. So that's my thoughts on it. In terms of the Gargoyle, it's hard for me to give a recommendation to everyone, because as I always do, I mean, digital's the future as far as I'm concerned in gigging, recording, live playing. But if you like tube heads, man, this one's a badass one. So yeah, for the cost versus the competition, the quality, the service, 5 stars, 2 thumbs up for me. I will be hanging on to this for the rest of my life, no doubt. So any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. Try to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next video. Bye.